Okay, we have 24 people. Okay, I'm going to start. Good evening. Welcome to our third At Home with the League. I'm Joanna Leifer. I'm the Program Committee Chair for the League of Women Voters New York City chapter. Every month, my program committee develops and presents a speaker to discuss an important social or political issue impacting New Yorkers. We used to have these live. We used to hold them at the New York Society for Ethical Culture, but since this pandemic, we have started presenting them virtually, and we have had a terrific response. We're anticipating having about 70 people show up. Today, we have a really special presenter who will discuss New York City planning, the past, the present, and the future in the wake of COVID-19. Marissa Lago of City Planning, and I will give you her full title later, will discuss new developments and as they come up. I'll tell you more about her in a few moments. There's somebody who's needs to be muted. Okay, next month, October, we have another really terrific, informative program. We will have a panel of speakers discussing New York's voting options. As we know, we have voting the day of. Now we also have early voting, and we have absentee voting. A lot of people are not aware that absentee voting, mail-in voting are not the same. So if you don't know about that, this will be a really good time to find out more. Before we begin our program, a couple of housekeeping issues. Number one, we are taping this event. So if you are uncomfortable being caught on tape, please sign off now. Next, I would like to introduce Leslie Siegel. Leslie wears two hats. She is one of the League's co-presidents, and she's a Zoom expert. Without her help, we probably would not be able to put together these programs. Leslie will give you some additional information about the League and some of our other events. Leslie.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you for the high praise. I don't think I'm quite the expert yet, but at least I'm a talented amateur. So thank you. So welcome everybody to our At Home with the League program. I think this also will be a magnificent program. I think it will be really interesting and very, very timely. However, as Joanna said, we do have other events as well. We are right in the middle of, the run up to the election, 24 days left for people to register to vote in New York, 49 days until the election itself. So we are spinning all wheels. We have the following upcoming committee meetings, which if you're interested in, please go to our Eventbrite page. Just look for us on Eventbrite and you can find the information. So tomorrow at 2 o'clock, we have our Education Committee. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., we have our Voter Services Committee. And if you're interested in volunteering to register voters, that is the committee to go to. They are the ones that talk about how we're going to do the voter registration, how we're going to do the get out the vote. And they coordinate all of the voter registration and get out the vote events that we do. So 6 p.m. tomorrow. All of these are open to everyone. They're totally free. Thursday at 4:30 p.m. if you are interested in registering voters, but you haven't been trained. So this is Thursday the 17th, 4:30 p.m. We have another installment of our virtual voter registration training. So it's a great training that really will answer all your questions about how you can register voters. And we are doing outdoor events now. So just be aware, we are doing voter registration events. You will have the opportunity to register voters and just sign up for the training. There has also been some late breaking news around a semi-online portal by which we can register New York City voters. I say semi-online because it doesn't register the voter fully online. So what you're able to do is have the voter enter some information, and I'll put the information in the chat later. You put the voter's information into the portal, or they do it themselves. It leads them through a process. And at the end of that, they can have the form either mailed to them, printed and mailed to them with a prepaid envelope. They just need to fill out some information as well as sign and date the form, or they can choose to download it and print it themselves. So that's a very exciting thing. The Campaign Finance Board has partnered with Turbo Votes to make that a reality. And I am putting into the chat. So if you or anyone you know would like to register to vote and isn't registered yet, again, 24 days left, this is a good option. We also have our Committee for Criminal Justice Reform meeting tomorrow night. Sorry, that's Thursday night at 6 p.m. And next week, we've got this Wednesday the 23rd at 6:30 p.m. We've got our Census Committee meeting. And on Thursday the 24th, this is a new committee. We had a kind of kickoff meeting, an initial kickoff meeting about 4 weeks ago, but this is our Housing Justice Committee. So if you're interested in all of the issues that are facing New Yorkers now when it comes to housing, whether it be affordable housing, the potential for evictions coming up, you can attend this and join the committee. It is brand new. You can be a part of shaping the committee. So that's the events we've got coming up in the next couple of weeks. And I also just want to plug us for membership. So if you're not a member of the League of Women Voters of the City of New York, this is a great time to join. We've got so much stuff going on. And it really gives you the ability to work with your community, whatever that community may be, however you define your community, to help them participate in the civics and electoral processes. It helps make a difference, right? You can register people to vote. You can tell them to get out the vote. You can ask them to complete the census. We have a very low completion rate of the census in New York City right now. It's a huge problem. So join us and we can tell you all about this and more. And you can go to our website and I will put that in the chat as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joanna.
Okay, thank you. Before we begin our program, there's a few more details I'd like to talk about. First of all, as we mentioned before, you are all muted. After we listen to Ms. Largo speak, we are going to have a 15-minute Q&A, but we can't have everybody personally asking questions. So we request you type in your question through the chat function at the bottom of the screen and put it to everyone. Somebody will read them off and Ms. Lago will answer them. Now I want to introduce our speaker, Ms. Marissa Lago. Ms. Lago has an impressive resume. She also wears two hats. Her titles are Director of the New York City Department of City Planning and the Chair of the City Planning Commission. She was appointed to these positions by Mayor de Blasio in March 2017. This is not the first time Ms. Largo has worked for New York City. She worked also under Mayor Koch and under Mayor Dinkins. Under them, she took part in two projects. She worked in the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge Park and the expansion and renovation of the Jacob Javits Center in Manhattan. Currently, she's working on Industry City, which is here in my borough of Brooklyn. Before taking this position, she served under President Obama as the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Assistant Secretary for International Markets and Development. In this capacity, she led the U.S. government's overseas development activities with the World Bank and its regional counterparts. In addition, she directed the Treasury's portfolio on international financial services regulations, climate finance, trade in financial services, and technical assistance in developing countries on public financial management. I'm exhausted already from hearing all about this. To continue, though, she has more impressive things, but I think the best way to go about this is to have Ms. Largo speak on her own And with no further ado, let me introduce Marissa Lago, please.
Thanks so much, Joanna and Leslie. And it's great to hear, Joanna, that you're a Brooklynite. That's my home borough, and I'm very proud of that. I'm also struck in listening to you describe the various meetings that are coming up and what the League is doing, of just how aligned you are with so many of the initiatives that we're involved with at the Department of City Planning. No one knows better than the League that we're in the midst of a very contentious decennial census count. We're 8 weeks away from a presidential election, and we're experiencing a global pandemic that's beyond what any Hollywood producer would have conjured up a year ago. I want to thank the League and congratulate the League on the work that you've done defending the integrity of the 2020 census, including in federal courts. Congratulations to you on your upset victory in getting a federal judge in California to issue a temporary injunction prohibiting the federal administration from cutting a month off of the time needed for the census count. This is truly important stuff as New York City works to count every single New Yorker, because that means that we'll get the representation, but also the federal funding that we deserve and need. The census is also important to us at the Department of City Planning because of the demographic data that it provides us, and that's integral to our department. I'm going to use the acronym DCP for the Department of City Planning, and that's the agency that I lead. So I might start by telling you a little bit about my background to set a wider context about the role of DCP. And from there, I'll delve more deeply into DCP's work, which is focused on helping the city recover both from the economic collapse that the virus precipitated and from the racial inequities that it laid so bare. I've spent most of my career in government in the fields of planning, economic development, and international finance, working at all three levels, city, state, and the federal government. If you could now share your screen so that we could start the slideshow. I'll wait a moment while Melissa, I would hope you'd be able to share your screen.
Yep, Joe is actually going to do it, and here we go.
Thank you.
Yep.
So my first New York City government job was in the Koch administration in 1983. And from that experience, I know just how challenging it can be to work in government during a time of deep fiscal constraints. I later worked for Mayor Dinkins and for the New York State Empire State Development Corporation under Governor Patterson. And I had the privilege of a lifetime in serving as an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury during President Obama's 2 terms. And this poster is of the Senate confirmed woman at the Treasury Department during the Obama administration, the largest number of Senate confirmees ever at the Treasury Department, typically a very male bastion. Today I work for Mayor de Blasio, and I wear the 2 hats that were described. First, I'm the director of DCP, which is an approximately 300-person city agency whose mission is to plan for an increasingly diverse city. Next slide. I'm also the chair of the 13-member City Planning Commission, and this acronym is CPC. Under the city charter, which you know is our municipal constitution, the CPC must approve all zoning changes. I'm especially honored to say that I've worked for an African-American mayor, governor, and president, and also that when I began as chair of the City Planning Commission a little over 3 years ago, I led a commission in which the majority of the commissioners were women. Next slide. Not only that, but I report to Vicki Bean, the mayor's second deputy mayor for housing and economic development, who, like the first, Alicia Glenn, is a woman. And this is especially noteworthy in what remains the very heavily male-dominated economic development and real estate sectors of New York City. And these are some of the commissioners that I work with near daily. This fact speaks volumes about the smart women who increasingly are running the world and about groups like the League, who are focused on elevating voices, and especially those of women and minorities, through civic education and engagement. It is because of your work and that of the suffragists who secured the right of women to vote 100 years ago that I'm here today. So I thank you. Next slide. So now we're going to delve into planning and zoning in New York City, which can be a relatively arcane topic. As I said, our mission at DCP is simple. We plan for the future of the city. We're the keepers of the zoning resolution, which is about a 1,500-page, incredibly complex, dense document, which is now thankfully digitized and available for free online. Dating back to 1916, the zoning resolution controls the shapes of building, what we refer to as the bulk, and also the uses that are allowed inside the buildings. In our city's many and varied residential, commercial, and manufacturing zoning neighborhoods. Under the de Blasio administration, we're focused on planning and zoning for equity. This means that we use land use policy, with zoning being an especially important tool, to incentivize the creation of housing, and most especially quality affordable housing, and to incentivize the creation of good paying jobs, and especially jobs for those who have been left out of the economic mainstream. In that vein, the administration has two ambitious and overriding development goals: to preserve about 300,000 affordable homes by 2020, and to create 100,000 good paying jobs in a decade. The CPC's role is to ensure that land use decisions are rational, that the decisions are informed by law and sound public policy, and that the city's important public review process is strictly followed. It's through this critical public land use review process that the CPC works to bring together local neighborhood perspectives while also addressing citywide needs. And that is no small feat in an era of NIMBY, not in my backyard. Even before COVID-19 hit, DCP, along with many of our sister city agencies, were working to decrease the inequity in our city. We brought public investments to in housing and job development programs across the city's boroughs. But because of historic disinvestment seen in some of our communities, and sadly, especially in our communities of color, we also focused on upgrading public infrastructure in these communities, from open space and parks to libraries, to schools, to sewers, the basics of what government provides. These investments were deliberate and targeted, and they have to continue, albeit in a very, very different fiscal climate. So let me dive into the real nuts and bolts of how we use our zoning system to create equity. Next slide. New York City is what we planners call an as-of-right city. That means that once the zoning is established, the zoning that controls both bulk and permitted uses, once it's established in a neighborhood, a property owner can go straight to the Department of Buildings to get a permit to build on their land. You don't have to come back to the City Planning Commission for approval. In New York City, we take this as of right approach for granted, but we are quite unique. Most major US cities require that just about every building obtain a lengthy discretionary land use approval, which seriously slows down the production of housing and also impedes architectural expression. If we look at just private sector development in the city, we estimate that 90% of it is done as of right. But if, for example, a landowner is seeking to build taller, a building that's taller than what's allowed under the current zoning, or if a landowner believes that a vacant parcel of land in a former manufacturing district would be better suited for housing, then they rightly need to put their project through New York City's land use review process. You may have heard of this difficult to pronounce term, ULURP, and that is the city's formal uniform land use review procedure. What that entails is submitting an application to DCP. We then work to ensure that the application for land use change is technically complete. The application is then forwarded to the City Planning Commission, where it begins a very formalized 7-month-long public review process. This process includes a minimum of 4 public hearings by the relevant community board, the borough president, the City Planning Commission, and the New York City Council. The preparation of an application and the process itself is expensive, and its length is generally measured not in days, weeks, or months, but in years. But once the zoning has been updated through the public review process, then construction under the new zoning is allowed to proceed as of right. Now, as I mentioned, this is almost unique, but we are proud of this as of right system because it allows a city that changes as quickly as New York City to have its buildings and its neighborhoods evolve as well, to not be stuck in a time warp. Next slide, please. Now I'll turn to the current fiscal crisis precipitated by COVID-19 and how it's shaping the city's approach to development, and by extension, the equity goals that land use policy can help us achieve. The first is to state the obvious. Development will slow down tremendously. This is a result both of the city's budget crisis, but also a huge slowdown in private investment. This is going to be most obvious in office construction markets, but it also holds true for housing development. Financing is getting ever more difficult to obtain. This steep slowdown is happening as the pandemic continues to strip jobs, especially from our poorest communities. Today, tenants are still protected from legal eviction, but unpaid rents mean trouble for small landlords because they still need to keep the lights on and to keep the boilers running this winter. Over the past several years and during our stunning decade-long economic growth streak, the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, significantly boosted the production of affordable housing with more than 30,000 affordable homes created just in fiscal year 2020. That is enough homes for 65,000 New Yorkers. But despite this good news, the crisis of homelessness and rent-burdened households existed in good fiscal times, and it is going to be exacerbated by the turndown. We won't be able to solve this unless we build more housing. Now, back in April and May, as city government was finally able to start focusing on more than just the immediate public health crisis, Deputy Mayor Bean asked all of the agencies that report to her, DCP, HPD, the city's Economic Development Corporation, among them, to provide her with a metric for what development projects were most likely to facilitate the city's recovery efforts. At DCP, we looked at projects that were teed up to begin the public review process to ensure that we're focusing the city's resources on the most urgent priorities: affordable housing, job creation, climate resiliency, and particularly in and for communities of color. We're prioritizing projects that leverage federal, state, and especially private funding. We're intensely focused on bringing public health investments to the communities hardest hit by COVID-19. We're focused on neighborhood resiliency, on climate sustainability, and critically for our future, on racial equity. From this perspective, and with about 15 months left in the administration, city planning is laser focused on New York City's recovery. Next slide. One project that is now pending before the City Planning Commission is the proposed expansion and modernization of the pediatrics wing at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. This was an important project before the pandemic, but it's that much more critical now. With over 700 beds, Maimonides is Brooklyn's largest hospital, And it's located in Borough Park, a diverse Hasidic Jewish and immigrant-heavy community that was hard hit by the pandemic. The proposal before the City Planning Commission will strengthen an institution that provides 43,000 inpatient discharges a year, including over 7,000 babies. That is 20 babies delivered every day at just this institution. Next slide. Another important priority planning and development project is in Central Brooklyn in an area known as Broadway Junction. At the intersection of 5 subway lines, 6 bus routes, and the Long Island Railroad, Broadway Junction is one of Brooklyn's largest transit centers. It is uniquely connected to employment and transit hubs citywide. It's a 15-minute ride to downtown Brooklyn, Jamaica, or Williamsburg, just 5 more minutes to Lower Manhattan, and it's 35 minutes from JFK Airport. It sits at the intersection of 6 largely residential and largely BIPOC neighborhoods: Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville, Bushwick, Cypress Hills, East New York, and Ocean Hill. And it's also adjacent to the East New York Industrial Business Zone, which is home to over 100 local industrial businesses, many of them hurting due to the pandemic. This area has been extensively studied by DCP and other city agencies, seeing the potential for a mixed-use, high-density regional commercial hub. To spark growth, the city is moving 1,200 jobs at the Human Resources Administration from downtown Brooklyn to a new building to be constructed at Broadway Junction. And Broadway Junction is a location that is much closer to where so many of HRA's clients live. This move creates an anchor tenant that will support the construction of a new office building, which will also have space for existing and future small businesses, and also for the retail that will be needed to support the 1,200 HRA jobs. Next slide, please. So going back to the nuts and bolts of the zoning resolution, in addition to as of right zoning, another very important concept in zoning is flexibility. This is especially important as a city as diverse as New York's, and at a time of such significant changes in our economy and how we live. Yesterday's manufacturing jobs look not at all like today's advanced manufacturing jobs. And decades ago, we used zoning to keep a factory belching smoke far away from a residential neighborhood. Advanced manufacturing has changed the need for this kind of strict separation of uses. For example, with modern environmental equipment, a local brew pub is no longer considered likely to blow up and be dangerous to nearby residences or passersby in the way that breweries 100 years ago were viewed as nuisances. But much as folks love having a micro brew pub on their local retail strip, our zoning rules don't allow them as of right. So this means that if you're an enterprising barkeeper or brewer, you would need to apply to the Department of City Planning, go through the city's expensive and long ULURP process, which could easily take 2 years, and that's a daunting task for a small business owner. In times like these, when economic collapse has come to us so quickly and companies are scrambling to stay open and keep their workers employed, out-of-date and inflexible zoning gets in the way of our recovery. Next slide. Another example of out-of-date zoning can be found in the city's hundreds of privately owned public spaces, or POPs, as we call them. Now, did you know that these delightful green interludes that dot some of the city's densest neighborhoods were creatures of the zoning resolution? The way it works is that the zoning resolution allows the landowner in certain dense areas of the city to build a larger building, but in return, the landowner creates and maintains a publicly accessible park-like space at ground level. Traditionally, the Department of City Planning has been highly restrictive about the use of POPs limiting them almost exclusively to much needed passive seating for neighborhood residents and for workers. But today, we see that our beloved POPs can and should be doing double or even triple duty. So earlier this year, the department asked the mayor to override the provisions of the zoning resolution that prevented POPs from being used for outdoor seating for nearby restaurants. We did this realizing that this was a way to help jumpstart a sector of the economy that has been so hard hit, and that it also provided a way for New Yorkers to be able to enjoy their streets and their POPs at a time when indoor dining wasn't possible. We also recognize that city bike usage had surged during the pandemic, which is a most welcome development. And so the mayor's emergency executive order also allows city bike docking stations to be placed in appropriate POPs. So these are just two examples of how our zoning resolution doesn't always comport with today's realities. What you may not know is that many, many sections of our zoning resolution haven't been updated in 60 years. We last updated zoning citywide in 1961. So think back to 1961. Those of you who, like me, are old enough to remember that time. Back then, the prevailing view was that outside of the Manhattan core, New York City should be heavily automobile centered, that our industrial uses should be very low scale, one story, surrounded by a sea of parking. That's not today's reality. So high on the department's to-do list is a rethinking of parking requirements, especially for commercial and manufacturing districts that are well served by public transportation. Next slide. An important point about the mayor's emergency executive orders is that they give us the chance to experiment, to see how changes can support equity and economic recovery. The Open Restaurants Program is a great example. It was also created under the mayor's emergency executive order, and the program waives both the zoning resolution and other city laws that tightly limit outdoor dining. The city's Open Restaurants Program has been a runaway hit with over 10,000 eating and drinking establishments taking advantage of it, and the public just loving the opportunity to enjoy an outdoor, socially distanced, safe meal. At City Planning, we're currently studying the benefits and impacts of making these types of changes permanent. If the zoning resolution were to be changed to allow outdoor dining with less red tape, it would require that full 7-month public land use review process that I mentioned earlier, with the opportunity again for extensive public input. Next slide. So in the introduction, you heard a reference to Industry City, and I would guess that some of you may have been reading the press, which has been very intense over the past weeks, about this proposed jobs development project. It's on the Brooklyn waterfront in Sunset Park, and this is a massive private sector investment that promises to provide more than 15,000 jobs at a time when we desperately need jobs. Plus, it also provides jobs near lower income immigrant communities that have been so hard hit by COVID-19. The Industry City proposal is right now in the final stages of the public land use review process that I described earlier. A few weeks ago, the City Planning Commission voted 11-1 to improve it. And earlier today, the City Council held a very contentious public hearing on Industry City. In the coming weeks, they have to decide whether to approve the proposal. For much of my lifetime, these large, muscular, industrial age loft buildings that make up Industry City sat abandoned. The image on the left is of the gloomy presence that you would see driving along the South Brooklyn waterfront along the Gowanus Expressway. New York City's economy has moved away from the heavy manufacturing that had originally characterized Industry City. The current owners of the Industry City complex are seeking to update the 1961 zoning that applies to the site and allow these buildings to be repurposed as a modern job hubs for the city's 21st century economy. Today's light manufacturing businesses look very different from the manufacturing businesses of 1961. They don't require the same massive spaces. They don't generate noxious pollutants. They thrive in a mixed-use environment, an environment in which nearby or connected office and retail spaces directly support the light manufacturer's products and may even attract customers. In addition to manufacturing, the Industry City proposal includes art studios and universities, uses that are so complementary to light manufacturing spaces. And the manufacturing includes advanced manufacturing, like producing drones, but it also includes more traditional garment production and food processing, though even these traditional manufacturers operate very differently today than they did in 1961, with far more use of sophisticated technology. The investments to date into the workspace at Industry City since 2015, when the new owners took over, have resulted in jobs growing from 1,900 to 8,000. But to get to 1,500 jobs, the owner is requesting that the zoning resolution be modified to allow flexibility, the term that I used before, for additional uses and also for more space. One more important point about Industry City is that it's a product of a virtuous cycle. First came public investments into two large and previously nearly abandoned publicly owned waterfront industrial properties. I'm referring to Bush Terminal and the Brooklyn Army Terminal. These public investments included upgraded roads, resiliency investments, and even a waterfront park. These public investments, in turn, have drawn private investments and jobs to the Sunset Park waterfront. And I don't know if you read last month, the city announced that Steiner Studios, which is famed for movies like The Producers, the movie musical, and Spider-Man 3, Steiner Studios is going to invest $320 million to build 8 new sound stages at Bush Terminal. This will create 1,800 construction and 2,000 permanent jobs. And these jobs come across the range of salary levels. This is absolutely economic development done right. This private sector investment and these jobs in Sunset Park, which is a heavily immigrant neighborhood, are a shot in the arm to diversity and equity, to say nothing about a vote of confidence in New York City as a place for jobs and also as the place to create classic entertainment. I'd like to wind up by thanking the League for your incredible service, for keeping our city and nation civically engaged, for helping us in our ongoing battle to assure that we have a good census, and most especially for your work to get out the vote. I know you won't take your eye off the prize, an educated and an educated and enfranchised public. We are all counting on you. Like you, part of city planning's mission is to make the work of government more accessible and transparent to the public. In that spirit, I'd like to tell you about city planning's nifty digital tools, ones that are aimed at helping New Yorkers engage in our important land use planning and decision-making process. Next slide. You can check out city planning's population fact finder, which relies on census data and puts graduate school level sophisticated socioeconomic data and makes it accessible for free and easy to use for everyday New Yorkers. You can also browse our community district profiles, which offer key facts about communities of every community board across the 5 boroughs. There's also our Metro Region Explorer, which is this neat interactive map showing population, housing, and employment trends within the tri-state New York City metropolitan region. In addition to being up on the screen now, links to these web tools have been dropped into the chat, but I have to warn you, once you start working with any of them, you will quickly find the hours just pass by because it is so fascinating and easy to learn about your neighborhood and other New Yorkers. These resources and many more allow anyone to learn about and better understand the communities that they live in, but also to participate in our civic decision-making processes. And speaking of decision-making, our last slide, please. Our newest public-facing planning tool, which we built over the last few months as we were prepared to restart the City Planning Commission's public land use review process, is NYC Engage. To avoid the need for public gatherings, the city's public land use review process was suspended by mayoral executive order on March 16th. So to restart that process while the pandemic is ongoing, we needed to be able to hold remote public gatherings. And to do that, the city planning team built in-house, no consultants, and in late July launched NYC Engage. This versatile and super easy to use tool allows the city planning commissioners to meet virtually and discuss land use proposals in public. It also allows regular New Yorkers and elected officials to listen to and to testify remotely. Besides formal city planning commission meetings, where they're required by the charter to elicit public testimony, the Department of City Planning relies on frequent and active engagement with residents, community boards, elected officials, business owners, advocacy organizations. Prior to the pandemic, the only way to participate in a City Planning Commission public hearing was either to submit written testimony or to trek down to our offices at 120 Broadway in Lower Manhattan on a Wednesday in the middle of a workday. Thanks to New York City Engage, working folks, seniors, others with mobility challenges can now testify remotely. NYC Engage means that a small business owner, a teacher, a construction worker, a parent who's home with a young child, folks who traditionally might have found it difficult to get to 120 Broadway in the middle of a workday can take a short break and testify from their kitchen table. So with New York City Engage up and running, we've resumed the City Planning Commission meetings just this past August 3rd, and the department's work on planning for a more equitable city is back up and running. And with that, I'd be delighted to take your questions.
Hi, this is Melissa Grace, and I work with Marisa at the Department of City Planning.
We can't hear you, Melissa. Melissa, you're very, very faint.
Okay, can people hear me any better now? Hold on.
No.
No. Okay. Hold on.
Could somebody else ask the questions? I believe there are a couple of more people back there.
Joe, would you be able to take over?
Yep, I will send these to Joe.
Sure. Yes, I could take over. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Joe.
Joe, you'll see, you can probably start at the end, the underlined questions. Should I just
Sure.
let you know?
Yes. All right. So here's a question. Please define affordable housing more specifically. Is there a maximum household income? How big are the apartments? Are they for large or poor families, single people, etc.?
That's a great question. And the short answer is all of the above. The long answer is that they're an incredibly complicated array. So let me start with respect to family sizes. Affordable housing projects run the gamut, and there is frequently discussion about what the neighborhood need is. Is it a neighborhood where there are larger families? We find that many immigrant communities have larger families, so the need there would be more for 2, 3, or even 4-bedroom units. In other neighborhoods, we see an elderly population where frequently the desire is to downsize. And so affordable housing projects for seniors are much more likely than family housing to have either studio units or frequently one-bedroom units, because that would allow for a caretaker or for a child to live there with the elderly resident. There are multiple, there's an alphabet soup of different affordable housing programs, and they specify the income bands. There is a concept in the federal government of area median income, and affordable housing projects are generally targeted to address people who are at 20%, 40%, all the way up in some programs to 130% of the area median income. There are also programs that are targeted towards specific populations, whether it is the formerly homeless or people in need of supportive housing. And so that's why I say in response to such a good question that the answer is all of the above. Any other questions, Joe?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes. Here's a question. Why is housing not included in the industry city proposal? Why would that space be used more for jobs rather than both jobs and housing that supports the local community?
That's a fabulous question. When we look at land use, we look at an area like Industry City has traditionally been used for manufacturing, and there is a large community of industrial advocates who very rightly hold our feet to the fire, saying that to be a complete city, you need a mix of housing and jobs. If one looks at the built form of Industry City, they are these massive industrial buildings that are separated from the residential neighborhood of Sunset Park by the elevated Gowanus Expressway. We think that we need a balanced approach that produces both jobs and housing, and that given the industrial past, given the industrial infrastructure that is in place, and given the physical separation from the Sunset Park neighborhood, that it made sense on this private application. The owners decided they wanted to keep it in manufacturing, office, university use, and the City Planning Commission and the department agreed.
Great. Bouncing off that last question a bit, why is it so hard to get a loan for development when interest rates are so low?
I'm afraid I am not a housing finance expert, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to punt on that one.
All right, and then we've got this one. Will the city repurpose office space as remote work takes hold and these spaces might sit empty?
A great question, but I'm going to do a slight rephrasing of it, which is the majority, the overwhelming majority of office space in the city is in private hands. And I think that we will see landowners, office building owners, evidence the creativity that we have seen before and adjust to a changing environment. Let's use as an example the financial district. When I was at college at Cooper Union in the early 70s, we used to love riding around the financial district on weekends because you could ride the wrong way down any street because there was not a car or a soul to be found on the streets. Those buildings in Lower Manhattan were found to have the wrong type of floor plate as office work evolved. And so we saw the office building owners repurpose these beautiful wedding cake tower type buildings into fabulous residences. And if now FIDI is a thriving mixed use neighborhood full of restaurants and amenities that supermarkets that one associates with a residential neighborhood. I do think that we will see changes with the changing nature of work. I think one that I anticipate will become prevalent is that people wanting to work closer to where they live. And certainly Broadway Junction, which I mentioned earlier, is a great example of that. It's a transit hub. It's a transit hub that's out in Brooklyn. But if we think about creating jobs in Broadway Junction, in Jamaica, Queens, that means that more people can then walk, bicycle, scooter to the office. And it also relieves strains on the subway system of so many folks needing in the prior economy to get into Manhattan for the jobs. And so that to me would be another virtuous cycle.
All right, great. And we could do this one as the last one, about how can the City Planning Commission approve projects that often receive a lot of community opposition during the hearings, during the public review process?
I was hoping to get that question, so thank you. As I had mentioned, 90% of private sector development occurs without coming before the Planning Commission because of our as of right. The projects that come before us, the overwhelming majority are non-controversial. We routinely will apply for an upzoning of a parcel of land that has lain vacant for decades, has been an eyesore, and at times a public safety threat, sits near a subway stop and is a perfectly appropriate location for a 6-story apartment building. And under the city's, under mandatory inclusionary housing, which is one of the signature accomplishments of this administration, when the upzoning occurs, a minimum of 25% of the units need to be permanently affordable. That is the bread and butter of the Planning Commission. But the projects that are controversial tend to attract a lot of controversy. The challenge that we face as a department, as a Planning Commission, is, as I mentioned, having our planning always be community informed, listening to, learning from the community, while recognizing at the same time that frequently the community does not speak with one voice. The public hearing that the Planning Commission held on Industry City was so instructive to the commissioners. It was eye-opening. There were scores of people who chose to testify, almost equally divided between residents who feared gentrification and other residents who had found jobs at Industry City or who had started small businesses and were able to tap into the job training facility that's available at Industry City. The other challenge that we face is that, we'll use affordable housing as an example. That you would find very few New Yorkers who would contest the fact that the city needs more housing and especially affordable housing. But at the same time, we find many New Yorkers who will say, yes, we absolutely have to, but not in my neighborhood. My neighborhood is special. And so being able to balance citywide needs with local concerns is part of the challenge. And I'll note that the City Planning Commission is comprised of 7 members. 7 of us, including me, are appointed by the mayor. 1 is appointed by each of the 5 borough presidents, and 1 is appointed by the public advocate. And what I so value about the Planning Commission is that were you to listen to the proceedings, and I urge you to, it's so easy on NYC Engage, you would be very hard pressed to figure out who is a mayoral appointee and who is appointed by another elected official. All of the commissioners take their role as city planning commissioners, not borough planning commissioners, very seriously to heart. And I'll note that on Industry City, the vote was 11-1. And I think that speaks to the strength of the proposal, the work that the department had put into it, and how seriously the commissioners take their jobs.
All right, actually, Marissa, if we have time, we do one more. Have the super tall buildings going up in Manhattan been approved via current zoning laws?
It is a mix. There are a couple of different ways that buildings could get put up. One, the zoning in Midtown Manhattan appropriately is the highest density zoning in the city. And we have, this is going to get wonky, but someone asked the question. We have a tool in zoning which allows a zoning lot merger. If you own a site in a high density zone and you purchase all of the adjacent 3-story brownstones, you can take the development rights from those brownstones, because they are not built out to the maximum that would be allowed, and concentrate them on your empty site. And we think that this is a good thing because what it leads to is a lot of preservation of lower scale buildings. And it also leads to one of the beauties of our skyline, which is that it is an undulating skyline. The other way, another way outside of zoning that one can build taller than what zoning allows is through, or more densely than what zoning allows, is by going to the Board of Standards and Appeal. And that is a separate city entity which reviews and then takes action on applications from landowners who believe that something about the nature of the property that they own and the current zoning regulations impose a hardship. And so that is another way that some of the buildings have been built. For a group focused on voting issues, remarkably sophisticated questions, so thank you.
Okay, I know you're just about need to get off. I noticed one question that I found interesting. I found a lot of them interesting, but there was one question about considering so many buildings are going to be empty now. Is there any thought on how they might be used for low-income housing?
Another great question. I don't think it's clear how many buildings will be empty. I think that so much of the recovery depends upon the length of it, right? A quick effective virus, a quick effective treatment is very different than, God forbid, living in this state for years to come. But I do think that there will be a rethinking of the nature of work, but also a rethinking of the nature of what qualifies as quality housing. I think many of us have discovered, those of us who live in the city, that an apartment that worked fine, we all New Yorkers think our spaces are too cramped, but an apartment that worked fine when you were going to the office, going out for social events, when you're living in the apartment near 24/7, suddenly feels very different. And so I do think in the nature of housing, we will be putting an increased focus on access to the outdoors. But do I think that there will be buildings that will be repurposed? Absolutely. One example of something that we're looking at is whether hotels, we already had a very large number of hotels come online over the prior years. With the industry having been hit so hard, with some hoteliers having announced that they have closed, they don't intend to reopen, is there a way that, given the layout, those buildings could be repurposed for supportive housing, where many of the services are provided centrally, so you don't necessarily need a complete kitchen in each unit. This is some of the preliminary exploration. I think, again, that we will benefit from the creativity of the real estate development, the landowning industry. And a key challenge is going to remain the issue of financing and the issue of affordability. Thanks for raising that question, Joanna. It's a good one.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. I don't want to keep you on. I know you've been speaking for a long time and a lot of these questions were pretty intense, but we want to thank you so much for telling us this about this, and to let you know that the League is available to you. If you have any concerns or would like to pass on information on how we might be able to work with you, you have my email, or Melissa has my email, and please, please let us know what's going on and what we can do to work with you. Thank you so, so much. This is
Totally my pleasure, and get back to work getting out that vote.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.